The air was thick with terror in a small German village in the year 1586. A woman named Anna, accused of whispering curses that made livestock sicken and crops wither, stood before her accusers. Her hands trembled as the townsfolk demanded she prove her innocence by sinking in the river. If she floated, it was the devil's work. If she drowned, she was innocent. There was no escape. This was the brutal reality of witch trials in the Middle Ages, where fear and superstition turned neighbor against neighbor in a frenzy of paranoia. But behind these horrifying moments lies a far deeper story, one of forbidden knowledge, secret rituals, and a world where magic was as real as the stones of the castles towering over the countryside. Welcome to the shadowy realm of medieval witchcraft, where the line between healer and heretic blurred under the watchful eyes of the church and crown. For centuries, whispers of potions, pacts, and midnight gatherings haunted the darkest corners of Europe. Some sought power in the old ways, blending herbs and incantations passed down through generations. Others were swept into the hysteria, innocent victims of a society desperate to explain misfortune. But what did witchcraft truly mean in these times? Was it rebellion, heresy, or something far more ancient? Over the next 25 segments, we'll unravel the tangled history of the dark arts in the Middle Ages, from the cunning folk who walked the edge of acceptance to the witch hunts that consumed thousands. You'll discover how fear of magic shaped laws, fed into folklore, and left scars still visible today. This isn't just a tale of persecution. It's a journey into the human heart where belief could condemn or save, where the night held both terror and possibility. So light a candle, steady your nerves, and step into the past. The secrets of medieval witchcraft await. Long before the witch trials stained Europe with fear, beliefs in magic and those who wielded it stretched back to the ancient world. The roots of medieval witchcraft twisted deep into the soil of pagan Europe, where druids, seers, and wise women spoke to spirits and shaped the fate of villages with charms and curses. These practices weren't seen as evil, they were part of life, as natural as the changing seasons. The Germanic tribes whispered to the gods in sacred groves. The Celts honored the land with rituals tied to the moon cycles. Even the Romans, for all their empire's might, consulted diviners before battle and kept household gods close. But when Christianity spread across the continent, these old ways didn't vanish, they transformed. The church condemned pagan rites, branding them as devilry, yet folk magic clung stubbornly to daily life. A mother might still hang protective herbs above her door, even as she prayed to the Virgin Mary. A healer's knowledge of roots and remedies passed down for generations now walked a dangerous line between piety and suspicion. What once was sacred tradition became heresy in the eyes of priests and scholars. By the Middle Ages, another layer had been woven into the tapestry of fear Christian demonology. Theologians like St. Augustine warned that all magic came from pacts with demons, invisible spirits hungry for human souls. The whispers grew louder. Witches didn't just heal or curse, they flew on brooms to Sabbats, kissed the devil's clawed hand, and plotted the ruin of Christendom. It was a terrifying fantasy, stoked by sermons and woodcuts, yet it felt real enough to spark flames under innocent feet. So when village gossip turned against a lonely widow or a wandering herbalist, it wasn't just old grudges at work. It was centuries of tangled belief, the shadow of pagan gods, the echo of folk charms, and the church's iron grip on truth, all crashing down on those accused. The medieval witch wasn't born in a single moment. She was shaped by time, fear, and the collision of worlds that refused to forget the old magic, even as they condemned it. The church's campaign against witchcraft began not with flames and stakes, but with parchment and ink. Long before the mass panics of later centuries, ecclesiastical scholars were quietly reshaping ancient superstitions into something far more sinister. One of the earliest and most influential documents was the Canon Episcopi, penned around the year 900. This decree didn't deny the existence of magic, it weaponized it. The text described groups of women who claimed to ride through the night with the pagan goddess Diana, an image that church leaders twisted into proof of devil worship. What had once been folk tales became evidence of satanic rebellion. The canon insisted these night flights were demonic illusions, but the damage was done. It created a template where traditional beliefs equaled heresy. A turning point came in the 13th century with the Vox in Roma, a chilling papal bull issued by Pope Gregory IX in 1233. This document took the fear further, detailing secret orgies where initiates kissed a toad-like demon and desecrated the Eucharist. For the first time, witchcraft wasn't just superstition, it was framed as an organized cult attacking Christianity from within. The Vox wove together older fears with new anxieties about hidden enemies, a narrative that would fuel persecutions for centuries. What made these documents so dangerous wasn't just their content, but their timing. The medieval church, battling heresies like the Cathars, saw dissent as existential threats. Witchcraft accusations became a way to root out not just magic users, but anyone challenging religious authority, local healers with knowledge of herbs, potential heretics, midwives who used charms during childbirth, suspect. The line between folk medicine and dark arts blurred deliberately, giving authorities justification to monitor and punish. Yet the most insidious shift was theological. By declaring that all magic required demonic pacts, even seemingly harmless spells, the church ensured there could be no innocent witchcraft. A village wise woman might see herself as helping neighbors, but in the eyes of priests poring over texts like the Canon Episcopi, she was trafficking with hell. This radical redefinition turned common practices into capital crimes, setting the stage for the terror to come. The parchments of clergymen would eventually become kindling for village pyres. In the year 1487, a book was published that would become the blueprint for centuries of terror. The Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, wasn't just another theological text. It was a detailed instruction manual on how to identify, interrogate, and exterminate those accused of witchcraft, written by Heinrich Kramer, a German inquisitor obsessed with Satan's supposed influence in the world. Kramer's venomous manifesto didn't just condemn magic, it specifically targeted women, weaving together misogyny, superstition, and zealous paranoia into a lethal weapon. The Malleus claimed that women were inherently weaker in faith and more susceptible to the devil's temptations, calling them naturally inclined to evil. It described witches as predators who stole men's virility, killed infants, and cursed fields with hailstorms. Every misfortune, failed crops, stillbirths, even impotence, could be blamed on a woman's supposed pact with darkness. The book's most sinister innovation was its legal framework. It provided step-by-step guidance for trials, encouraging torture to extract confessions and detailing what signs to look for, like birthmarks or the inability to weep, proof, they claimed, of demonic allegiance. Kramer's work wasn't immediately embraced by the church, but its influence spread like poison. Printed on the newly invented Gutenberg press, the Malleus became one of Europe's first bestsellers, reaching inquisitors, judges, and paranoid villagers alike. Its rhetoric turned suspicion into conviction, giving ordinary people permission to see malice in a healer's herbs or a widow's muttered prayers. Where local superstitions once flickered at the edges of society, the Malleus fanned them into roaring flames. The impact was catastrophic. In regions where the book took hold, accusations surged. Women, especially those who lived alone, practiced midwifery, or owned property, were dragged into trials based on hearsay or personal grudges. The Malleus didn't just justify persecution, it weaponized everyday conflicts, turning neighbor against neighbor under the guise of holy duty. Centuries before the infamous Salem witch trials, Kramer's words paved the way for thousands to burn, drown, or hang. His legacy wasn't just a book, it was a permission slip for mass murder wrapped in the cloak of divine justice. In the early Middle Ages, secular laws often treated witchcraft as a minor nuisance rather than a capital crime. Early legal codes, like the Salic law of the Franks from the 6th century, punished harmful magic with fines comparable to penalties for theft or property damage. A spell that caused someone's death might cost the caster a hefty sum, but not their life. This reflected a pragmatic view. Magic was dangerous, but not inherently demonic. Kings and lords had bigger concerns than village charm makers, and accusations rarely spiraled into mass panic. But as the church's influence seeped into courts and kingdoms, the legal landscape darkened. By the 13th century, Emperor Frederick II's constitutions of Melfi marked a turning point. For the first time in secular law, heresy and witchcraft were explicitly linked, and the punishment was death by fire. The shift wasn't just about fear, it was political. Rulers realized that branding enemies as witches could consolidate power, a noble resisting royal authority. Accuse them of sorcery, a rival faction gaining influence, paint them as conspiring with demons. Witchcraft became a convenient tool for silencing dissent under the guise of divine justice. Local courts soon followed suit. In the Swiss canton of Valais, trials in the 1420s saw hundreds executed for attending nocturnal Sabbats and casting ruinous spells. What made these trials different was their scale and the legal innovations they introduced. Torture, once restricted in medieval law, became routine to extract confessions. Judges accepted dreamlike testimonies about flying to gatherings or shape-shifting into animals as ironclad evidence. The line between fantasy and reality blurred, and the law, once a shield against mob violence, became its weapon. By the 15th century, the legal machinery of witch hunts was fully operational. The Carolina Code of 1532, enacted under Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, standardized witchcraft as a capital offense across German territories. It mandated burning for those convicted of causing harm through magic, while even white witches who claimed to heal faced imprisonment or exile. The message was clear: no magic was benign. Every charm, every whispered incantation was a potential pact with darkness. Yet the harshest laws emerged where authority was weakest. In regions ravaged by war or famine, like the Basque Country during the Spanish Inquisition, witchcraft accusations soared. Desperate rulers used trials to project control, offering chaotic communities a scapegoat for their suffering. The flames that consumed accused witches weren't just about punishment. They were spectacles of order, a way to show that someone, even an innocent widow, was paying for the chaos. The tragedy of these laws wasn't just their brutality, but their unpredictability. A village might ignore magic for decades, then turn deadly overnight. A healer praised one year could be kindling the next. Legal systems meant to protect the innocent became engines of paranoia, proving that when fear writes the law, justice rarely survives the fire. Not all witches were feared equally in the medieval imagination. The accusations fell into distinct categories, each feeding a different layer of societal terror. At the most basic level stood the village healer, often an older woman skilled in herbs and midwifery. She might ease childbirth pains with mugwort or treat fevers with willow bark, knowledge passed down through generations. But when a child died despite her remedies, or a plague struck after her visit, gratitude could curdle into suspicion. These women walked a razor's edge, revered one day, reviled the next. Their real crime wasn't malice, but autonomy operating outside the control of church and male physicians. Then came the storm witches, accused of wielding nature itself as a weapon. In agrarian communities, hail could ruin a year's harvest in minutes. When unexplained weather struck, rumors spread of old women who conjured tempests by stirring cursed water or hanging enchanted rags in trees. German folklore spoke of hexenmeisters brewing storms in cauldrons, while Swiss trial records describe witches selling wind to sailors. These tales reveal a deeper truth. In a world without meteorology, blaming a human face for natural disasters made chaos feel controllable. executing a storm which became a perverse form of weather magic, a sacrifice to ensure better crops next season. But the most visceral fears centered on the baby killers. Pamphlets and sermons depicted hags who suffocated infants in their cradles or stole unbaptized children for the devil's feasts. This myth preyed on crushing infant mortality rates. Nearly half of children died before age 5 in some regions. Rather than confront random tragedy, communities imagined a coven's sinister hand. Some accusations targeted midwives, their access to birth chambers making them easy scapegoats. Others fell on grieving mothers themselves. A woman who lost multiple children might be accused of offering them to dark forces. Less infamous but equally feared were the shapeshifters. Trial transcripts from Norway to Hungary describe witches taking animal forms: wolves to raid livestock, cats to spy on neighbors, even flies to slip through keyholes. These stories often originated from someone claiming they'd wounded a beast, only to find a local woman sporting the same injury. The fantasy served a dual purpose. It explained livestock deaths while reinforcing the idea that evil could hide in plain sight. Finally, there were the political witches, powerful men and women accused not for folklore crimes, but because they threatened the social order. When a noblewoman like Alice Keiteler in 14th century Ireland controlled vast estates without male heirs, her wealth proved she'd bargained with demons. When a rival merchant's business thrived suspiciously, his competitors whispered of devil-given luck. These high-profile cases show how witchcraft accusations could mask land grabs, vendettas, or anxieties about upward mobility. What unified these disparate types wasn't reality, but projection. Each category reflected society's deepest vulnerabilities: fear of uncontrollable nature, grief over lost children, distrust of independent women. The medieval witch was a canvas onto which communities painted their terrors, then burned her to ashes, hoping the nightmares might burn too. While the infamous witch hunts of the 16th and 17th centuries dominate popular memory, the flames of persecution were already crackling centuries earlier. Among the first documented cases to reveal the deadly potential of witchcraft accusations was the trial of Alice Keiteler in Ireland in 1324. A wealthy widow with 4 husbands buried under suspicious circumstances, Alice was everything medieval society feared: independent, influential, and unafraid to defy expectations. Her stepchildren accused her of poisoning their father and using sorcery to amass her fortune. When authorities searched her home, they claimed to find bizarre ingredients: raven's claws, poisonous herbs, even a demonic familiar who appeared as both a black dog and a shadowy man. The accusations painted a picture straight out of clerical nightmares: a high-status woman allegedly leading a coven that included her servant Petronilla de Meath. What made Alice's trial extraordinary wasn't just the lurid details, but the political undercurrents. Bishop Richard de Ledred, determined to assert ecclesiastical authority over secular elites, used the case to humiliate Kilkenny's Anglo-Irish aristocracy. When local officials resisted arresting Alice, the bishop excommunicated them. Alice herself fled, likely to England, but Petronilla wasn't so lucky. After being flogged into confession, she became Ireland's first recorded witch burning. The trial's parchment trail reveals how accusations could serve as weapons in power struggles, with witchcraft masking battles over land, inheritance, and church dominance. A century later, the Alps echoed with similar terror during the Valais witch trials of 1428. In the mountainous region now split between Switzerland and France, entire villages became consumed by hysteria. Unlike Alice's politically charged case, the Valais panic erupted from below ordinary peasants accusing neighbors of summoning storms and murdering livestock. Over 8 years, nearly 400 people were executed, many burned alive in mass spectacles. The trials introduced tropes that would haunt future hunts: confessions of flying to Sabbats, shape-shifting into wolves, and feasting on children's flesh, all extracted under torture so severe some victims implicated their own families. What set Valais apart was its scale and the way rumors metastasized. One shepherd's claim of seeing a nocturnal gathering spiraled into a vast conspiracy theory, with accused witches naming accomplices to end their torment. Whole families were wiped out, their property seized by accusers. Here, the medieval witch hunt revealed its most horrific trait, its ability to become self-sustaining, where each confession bred fresh accusations in an endless cycle of fear. These early trials laid the groundwork for centuries of persecution. Alice's case showed how witchcraft charges could topple the powerful, while Valais proved how easily they could engulf the powerless. Together, they demonstrated that whether fueled by politics or panic, the machinery of accusation rarely left innocence intact. The most chilling visions of witchcraft weren't found in whispered village rumors, but in the lurid fantasies of medieval clerics and judges. At the heart of their terror lay the witches' Sabbat, a grotesque carnival of inverted piety where the faithful imagined secret gatherings drenched in blasphemy and blood. These weren't just meetings, they were cosmic rebellions, a dark mirror of church ritual designed to shock and horrify. According to trial confessions extracted under torture, the Sabbat began with a journey. Witches supposedly smeared themselves with enchanted ointments made from murdered infants' fat, then mounted broomsticks or transformed into animals to fly to remote locations. Forests, mountaintops, even abandoned churches became stages for the unholy spectacle. Upon arrival, they'd find not a pagan bonfire, but a twisted imitation of Christian worship. The devil himself presided, often appearing as a monstrous hybrid part man, part goat, with burning eyes and a frozen kiss that marked initiates. Descriptions varied by region, but certain horrors recurred. In Normandy, accused witches spoke of feasting on roasted children, their flesh served on silver platters. Swiss trials detailed orgies where kin avoided each other to prevent recognition, a perversion of social order. German records claimed witches danced back-to-back in circles, mocking the harmony of village festivals. The most persistent motif was the desecrated Eucharist stolen, hosts trampled or stabbed with knives, a direct assault on the body of Christ. Why did these particular nightmares take root? The Sabbat myth served multiple dark purposes. For the church, it transformed scattered folk magic into an organized anti-religion, justifying brutal repression. For villagers, it explained misfortune. If your crops failed, it wasn't bad luck. It was because witches danced on your fields at midnight. The orgiastic elements reflected clerical obsessions with female sexuality, framing independent women as vessels of corruption. Yet the Sabbat's greatest power was its adaptability. In Spain, where the Inquisition feared secret Jews, witches allegedly practiced Judaism. In Protestant areas post-Reformation, they supposedly parodied Catholic rites. Each community projected its deepest anxieties onto the canvas of the Sabbat, creating a self-reinforcing cycle. A tortured woman would parrot her interrogator's leading questions, her confession then codified into lawbooks, inspiring fresh rounds of accusations. What makes these fantasies so haunting isn't their gore, but their intimacy. Neighbors imagined people they'd known for years, the midwife who delivered their children, the herder who shared milk, sneaking off to kiss demons. The Sabbat wasn't just a story, it was a collective nightmare that turned trust into suspicion, and suspicion into fuel for the flames. The idea that witches sealed their unholy power with ink and blood wasn't just superstition, it was theology. Medieval scholars, poring over ancient texts and church doctrine, became convinced that no mortal could wield magic without a patron from the underworld. The pact with the devil wasn't whispered folklore, it was a meticulously documented transaction, complete with signatures, witnesses, and terrible terms. Some of the earliest accounts came from the infamous confessions forced out during trials. In 1437, a French woman named Piron claimed she'd met the devil in the guise of a handsome man who promised her wealth if she'd renounce God and sign his book. She described dipping a needle into her finger, tracing her name in blood on parchment that burned cold to the touch. Similar stories emerged across Europe. Witches who'd signed away their souls on mountain peaks, in moonlit graveyards, or even in their own homes, with the devil appearing as a black-clad gentleman carrying a ledger. The details varied, but the core remained. Power demanded payment, and ink alone wouldn't suffice. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas argued these pacts weren't symbolic, but legally binding contracts under demonic law. Just as a vassal pledged fealty to a lord, a witch became the devil's vassal, her body marked by his claws as proof of ownership. Some texts described inverted baptism rituals where demons anointed initiates with foul oils instead of holy water. Others claimed the signed contracts were stored in Hell's archives, with demons assigned to enforce the terms. The most chilling belief, that witches who tried to repent would find their pact suddenly materializing, appearing under their pillow or in their Bible, as a reminder that Hell's bureaucracy never misplaced a soul. What made the blood signature so potent in medieval thought was its echo of sacred covenants. If Christians were sealed with Christ's blood in communion, then witches perverted that imagery, using their own blood to swear fealty to darkness. Trial records obsessively noted whether accused witches had devil's marks, moles, or scars supposedly left by demonic teeth or claws during the signing. These marks became proof enough to condemn, turning the body itself into evidence of treason against heaven. Yet the cruelest irony lay in who these pacts supposedly targeted. Confessions often describe the devil preying on the desperate. A starving mother offered bread for her children, a sick man promised healing, a rejected lover given vengeance. The contracts preyed on human frailty, mirroring real-world exploitation by those in power. When a drought-starved village accused an old widow of signing for storms, they weren't just fearing magic. They were confronting their own powerlessness in a world where the devil, like the Lord in his castle, seemed to hold all the bargaining chips. By the 15th century, the blood pact wasn't just a myth, it was a legal framework. Judges demanded accused witches describe their contracts in sickening detail during trials, turning fantasy into courtroom fact. These stories endured because they made the abstract tangible. Evil wasn't just an idea, but ink on parchment, a signature that could be found, read, and used to kindle the pyre. The parchment might burn, but the terror it represented lingered for centuries. The image of witches soaring across the moon on broomsticks is so familiar it feels almost playful until you uncover the dark reality behind the legend. Medieval trial records reveal a far more sinister belief, that witches didn't just ride brooms for fun, but anointed themselves with hallucinogenic pastes to commune with demons. These so-called flying ointments weren't fairy tale props. They were complex, often deadly concoctions brewed from plants with terrifying psychoactive properties. One recipe preserved in 16th century texts lists ingredients like deadly nightshade, hemlock, and mandrake root, all plants known to induce vivid hallucinations of flight or transformation. When rubbed onto the skin, especially in sensitive areas like the armpits or thighs, these toxins could trigger sensations of weightlessness, euphoria, or even the terrifying illusion of being torn apart and reassembled. A German confession from 1582 describes a woman who swore she'd flown to a Sabbat after applying such an ointment, only to wake hours later with vomit on her dress and no memory of how she'd reached a nearby forest. Modern pharmacology confirms her experience. The alkaloids in these plants disrupt the nervous system, creating out-of-body delusions. But why brooms? The answer lies in medieval domesticity. Inquisitors obsessed over how witches might apply their ointments to the most secret parts. A broom's handle, often kept near the hearth, became the imagined vehicle, either smeared with the paste or used as an applicator. Some trial transcripts even describe witches greasing the broomstick before straddling it, suggesting the tool wasn't just symbolic, but a practical, if misguided, method for absorption. The folklore took stranger turns, with accounts of witches transforming into animals. A French shepherd's testimony from 1496 claimed he'd wounded a wolf with his knife, only to find a local widow bleeding from the same wound. Scholars now suspect such stories originated from ointments containing hysteria, a compound that can cause users to hallucinate their own bodies morphing. The wolf witch may have truly believed she'd shapeshifted during a toxic trance. What makes these ointments more than macabre curiosities is their link to ancient shamanic traditions. Across Europe, remnants of pagan practices involved using similar plants for spiritual journeys. The medieval church criminalized this knowledge, rebranding sacred trance inducers as tools of Satan. A midwife's pain relief salve became a flying potion, and a healer's ritual became proof of demonic allegiance. The cruelest irony, many accused witches likely never used these ointments at all. The recipes survive mainly in the torture-extracted confessions of victims who'd been fed the details by their interrogators. Yet the myth persisted, turning folk medicine into heresy and ensuring that even the most mundane household object, a broom by the fire, could become evidence of a pact with hell. When the Black Death swept through Europe in 1347, it didn't just leave corpses in its wake, it left a shattered world desperate for answers. As villages emptied and the stench of decay hung thick in the air, survivors grappled with an unthinkable question: why would God allow such suffering? The church preached penance, physicians bled patients to no avail, and when neither prayers nor medicine stopped the dying, people turned to an older, darker explanation. Someone must have summoned this horror, someone must be to blame. The plague's arrival coincided with a surge in witchcraft accusations unlike anything seen before. In the Swiss town of Neuchâtel, chroniclers recorded that as the pestilence peaked in 1348, mobs dragged elderly women from their homes, accusing them of poisoning wells with devil's paste. Similar outbreaks of violence flared in Germany, where rumors spread that witches were smearing door latches with plague ointments. These weren't isolated panics, they followed a grim pattern. When the living could no longer bear the weight of random death, they invented malice behind it. What made the plague years so lethal for the accused wasn't just fear, but theology. Preachers like the Franciscan friar Bernardino of Siena declared the Black Death god's punishment for tolerating witchcraft. His sermons wove pestilence and sorcery into a single narrative. If communities didn't root out every hidden witch, more divine wrath would follow. This logic transformed local healers into existential threats. A woman known for herbal remedies might have been tolerated in peacetime, but when her neighbor's family died coughing blood, her knowledge became proof of conspiracy. Even acts of mercy backfired. Midwives who tended the sick were especially vulnerable, as their survival amid death seemed suspiciously miraculous. The accusations took grotesque forms. In Provence, witnesses claimed to see witches dancing atop mass graves, their laughter carrying on the wind. Austrian trial records describe plague spreaders blowing enchanted dust from church steeples. These fantasies reveal a desperate need to humanize an indiscriminate killer. Blaming witches gave the terrified a target for their rage, a way to fight back against an invisible enemy. Yet the cruelest irony lay in the demographics of the accused. Older women, already marginalized in medieval society, bore the brunt of suspicion. Many were paupers who'd survived famine and war only to be condemned for outliving younger victims. Others owned small properties coveted by neighbors. The plague didn't create these tensions, it weaponized them. In regions where 1/3 of the population perished, inheritance disputes turned deadly with a single whispered accusation. By the time the Black Death faded, it had etched a terrible lesson into Europe's psyche. When the world unravels, witchcraft fears follow. The persecutions of 1348 weren't an aberration, they were a rehearsal for centuries of hunts to come, proving that catastrophe and scapegoats walk hand in hand through history's darkest chapters. In a world where witchcraft lurked in every shadow, medieval people crafted a fortress of defenses against unseen malice. Charms dangled from belts, prayers whispered at twilight, and intricate rituals marked doors and thresholds, each one a desperate attempt to keep the dark arts at bay. Among the most common protections were amulets, small objects believed to repel evil through their very essence. A twist of rowan wood tucked into a pocket, its berries red as blood, was said to break curses. Iron nails, cold and unyielding, hung above cradles to stop night hags from stealing infants. Even everyday items like garlic and salt took on sacred power, scattered across doorways to create barriers no witch could cross. The church offered its own arsenal of spiritual safeguards. Holy water, blessed by priests, was sprinkled on fields to protect crops from blight. Consecrated wax medals stamped with saints' images called Agnus Dei charms were worn against skin to ward off demonic possession. Families recited the Lorica of St. Patrick, a poetic prayer envisioning divine light as armor against every fierce, merciless force that may come upon my body and soul. These weren't casual superstitions, they were vital rituals as routine as locking doors at night in a neighborhood stalked by thieves. But the most elaborate defenses blurred the line between religion and folk magic. In Bavaria, farmers buried witch bottles, ceramic jugs filled with nails, urine, and hair under their hearths. The theory was simple: if a witch sent a curse, it would rebound into the bottle's contents, tormenting her instead. English midwives secretly slipped silver coins into birthing rooms, believing the metal disrupted evil spells. Across Scandinavia, door frames were carved with intricate witch marks, apotropaic symbols like interlocking circles or hexafoils meant to trap malignant spirits in endless labyrinths. Some rituals relied on eerie mimicry. To undo a witch's weather magic, Swiss villagers would fling brooms into hailstorms, symbolically sweeping away the tempest. If livestock sickened, Bohemian healers might bleed the animals and bake their blood into bread, then feed it to dogs in a grotesque transfer of corruption. These acts reveal a grim truth. Medieval people didn't just fear witchcraft, they believed they could fight it on its own terms, turning the dark arts logic against itself. Yet protection came at a cost. The same herbs that guarded against curses like verbena or St. John's wort could mark a woman as suspicious if she harvested them under a full moon. A prayer muttered too fervently might be mistaken for an incantation. In trying to shield themselves, many walked a razor's edge, knowing that today's charm could become tomorrow's evidence. The irony was cruel but undeniable. The tools meant to repel accusation sometimes forged the chains that bound the accused. Medieval literature didn't just reflect fears of witchcraft, it amplified them, transforming superstitions into stories that shaped how generations imagined the dark arts. Take Dante Alighieri's Inferno, where sorcerers and diviners occupy the eighth circle of hell, their heads twisted backward as eternal punishment for daring to see the future. Dante's vivid imagery, bodies contorted, voices choked with weeping, didn't merely describe sin, it codified magic as a perversion of divine order. The poet's condemnation resonated because it mirrored real-world anxieties, that witches and seers threatened the boundary between mortal and divine knowledge. When Dante's pilgrim encounters the sorceress Manto, her fate, a soul trapped in a swamp of filth, reinforced the idea that magic users weren't just misguided but actively monstrous. Yet not all literary witches were so grotesque. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales offered a subtler, more unsettling portrait in The Wife of Bath's Tale. Here, an elderly hag embodies the ambiguous power of medieval witchcraft. She's neither wholly evil nor benign, but a shape-shifting enigma who lectures knights on morality after magically saving his life. Her transformation from loathsome crone to beautiful bride underlines a tension in medieval thought. Could magic ever serve virtue, or was it always corrupt? Chaucer's ambiguity was radical for its time, suggesting that even the Church's rigid categories couldn't fully contain the complexity of human belief. Arthurian legends took this duality further. Morgan Le Fay, perhaps medieval literature's most infamous enchantress, began as a healer in early Welsh tales before morphing into King Arthur's treacherous half-sister. By the time Sir Thomas Malory penned Le Morte d'Arthur in the 15th century, Morgan was a full-fledged antagonist, using potions and illusions to undermine Camelot. But her evolution reveals more about shifting cultural fears than any real dark arts. As the Middle Ages waned, the independent, knowledgeable woman, once tolerated as a wise healer, became increasingly demonized in story and law alike. Morgan's literary downfall paralleled the very real persecution of women accused of witchcraft outside the page. Even saints' lives contributed to the mythology. The Golden Legend, a wildly popular medieval text, described saints battling witches who summoned storms or poisoned entire towns. These stories weren't just entertainment, they were cautionary tales that blurred the line between fiction and sermon. When a priest read aloud about Saint Dominic outwitting a witch's curse, congregations absorbed the lesson. Magic was real, dangerous, and required the church's intervention. What made these literary portrayals so potent was their ability to turn abstract fears into flesh and blood characters. Dante's contorted souls, Chaucer's enigmatic hag, Morgan Le Fay's scheming, they gave witch hunters a visual language for their paranoia. Long before the Malleus Maleficarum, literature taught Europe how to recognize a witch in their midst. The irony, many of these stories drew on pagan folklore that church authorities claimed to despise, proving that even as the Middle Ages condemned witchcraft, it couldn't stop spinning tales about its terrifying allure. Buried beneath the floorboards of a 17th-century English cottage, archaeologists pried open a small, discolored bottle, its neck stuffed with rusted nails, bent pins, and a scrap of parchment inscribed with jagged symbols. This wasn't garbage, it was a weapon. Witch bottles, as they're now known, were one of medieval Europe's most chilling defenses against the dark arts. Crafted from glass or ceramic, these vessels were filled with a grotesque slurry urine, hair, even menstrual blood sealed with wax and hidden where evil might creep in. The logic was visceral. If a witch sent a curse, it would be drawn into the bottle, trapped by the nails like a fly in venomous honey. Excavations from Norwich to Plymouth reveal these artifacts weren't rare. They were a widespread armor against invisible terror. Far older but equally eerie are the curse tablets archaeologists have pried from Roman baths and medieval wells. Thin sheets of lead, scratched with inverted prayers and the names of enemies, then folded and stabbed with nails. A tablet uncovered in Germany's Black Forest chillingly invokes demons to gnaw at the heart of a rival, while another from Britain's Bath Spa begs the goddess Sulis to drown a thief as this writing melts away. These weren't the fantasies of peasants, they've been found in monasteries, castles, and merchant homes, proof that even the pious sometimes turn to darker forces. What makes them uniquely medieval is their evolution. Early tablets targeted thieves or lovers, but by the 14th century they increasingly named workers of maleficium, a Latin term for harmful magic. Then there are the protective marks, invisible to the untrained eye but etched into the very bones of medieval buildings. Archaeologists using 3D imaging have uncovered hundreds of hexafoils interlocking circles carved into door frames, hearthstones, and barn beams. Found from Scotland to Transylvania, these witch marks weren't decorations. They were sacred labyrinths meant to confuse and trap evil spirits. Some resembled daisy wheels, others complex geometric knots, all serving the same desperate purpose, to shield a home from the unseen. At Knowle House in England, restoration workers discovered marks hidden under centuries of paint, clustered where witches might slip in window latches, bedposts, even the hinges of baby cradles. Perhaps the most haunting finds are the ritual deposits, objects deliberately concealed within walls or under thresholds. A child's shoe crammed into a chimney in York. A mummified cat tucked behind a church altar in France. These weren't accidental losses. Folklore held that such items could absorb or repel dark energy. Scholars debate whether they were offerings to benign spirits or traps for malevolent ones, but their prevalence suggests a society where no home felt truly safe without them. Yet the most revealing artifacts may be the simplest: bundles of herbs discovered in medieval latrines and middens. Analysis shows plants like sage, rue, and mistletoe, all known in herbals as protections against witchcraft. Found knotted with red thread, a color believed to repel evil, these humble bundles whisper of everyday resistance. A mother hanging vervain over a cradle, a farmer tucking yarrow into his hat brim small acts of defiance against a world where magic lurked in every shadow. These objects tell a story far richer than superstition. They reveal a medieval world that saw magic not as fantasy, but as a tangible force, one that required tangible defenses. Every bent nail, every carved symbol, was a plea for control in an era where the line between the natural and supernatural blurred like smoke from a witch's pyre. The overwhelming majority of those accused during the witch hunts weren't just any villagers, they were women, often elderly, poor, or living on society's margins. This wasn't accidental. Medieval Europe's fear of witchcraft intertwined with deep-seated misogyny, transforming everyday female autonomy into a threat that needed eradication. Texts like the Malleus Maleficarum didn't just claim women practiced magic, they argued women were biologically predisposed to evil, calling them intellectually like children with weak faith and insatiable lust. These weren't fringe ideas, they echoed centuries of church doctrine. Early Christian writers like Tertullian had declared women the devil's gateway, while medieval theologians framed Eve's biblical sin as proof of female moral frailty. When misfortune struck failed crops, stillborn babies, a husband's impotence, a woman's body became the easiest canvas onto which communities projected their fears. But why women specifically? The answers lie in the cracks of medieval society. Midwives, though respected for their skills, were doubly vulnerable. Their knowledge of childbirth and herbs made them suspects when infants died or pregnancies failed. A widow inheriting property disrupted male inheritance lines, giving greedy relatives motive to accuse her. Even something as simple as a woman living alone, without a father or husband to vouch for her, could brand her as suspicious. The Malleus spelled it out: when a woman thinks alone, she thinks evil. This wasn't just paranoia, it was a system. Women who stepped outside prescribed roles, whether healers, outspoken wives, or those rejecting marriage, became lightning rods for communal anxiety. The gendered violence of which trials often played out in grotesque detail. Interrogators obsessed over women's bodies, searching for devil's marks like moles or scars, which they claimed were left by demonic familiars during nighttime feedings. In some trials, witch prickers used needles to probe accused women for insensible spots, areas allegedly numb to pain where the devil had sealed his pact. The irony was cruel. The same patriarchal systems that policed female sexuality now weaponized it, with confessions under torture describing lurid Sabbats where women engaged in orgies with demons. These fantasies served a dual purpose. They titillated male interrogators while reinforcing the idea that women's unchecked desires led to societal ruin. Yet the economic angle was just as damning. Across Europe, patterns emerged where accusations spiked during property disputes. In the German town of Trier, wealthy widows saw their lands confiscated after being burned as witches. In Scotland's North Berwick trials, fishermen's wives were targeted when their salt-preserving techniques vital for survival were reinterpreted as dark magic. Witch hunts became a way to erase inconvenient women while redistributing their assets, all under the guise of divine justice. The legacy of this gendered terror lingers. Modern analyses of trial records reveal how accusations amplified existing prejudices. Elderly women were hags, outspoken women, shrews, sexually independent women, brides of Satan. It wasn't just about punishing magic, it was about enforcing conformity. When a village executed a witch, it wasn't merely killing a woman, it was sending a message to every surviving woman about the cost of stepping out of line. The fires that consumed them weren't just pyres, they were the violent enforcement of a world where female power, knowledge, or even solitude could be criminalized with a single whispered accusation. When witch hunters dragged a suspect into the interrogation chamber, their eyes weren't just searching for fear, they were hunting for physical proof of damnation. Across Europe, inquisitors became obsessed with so-called witch marks, blemishes, moles, or scars believed to be the devil's brand. These weren't ordinary birthmarks. Manuals like the Malleus Maleficarum described them as unnaturally shaped, often resembling animal claws or inverted crosses, and most tellingly, numb to pain. A Scottish trial record from 1591 chillingly notes how an accused woman's mole didn't bleed when pierced with a 3-inch needle, proving it was no natural mark but Satan's own seal. The concept of the devil's mark twisted older folk beliefs about body signs. Pagan traditions had long viewed unusual markings as omens, but the medieval church recast them as evidence of literal pacts. Some marks allegedly appeared during initiation rites, where demons supposedly bit or clawed their new servants. Others were said to be supernatural teats used to feed familiars, imps, or animals that did a witch's bidding. In England, searches for these witches' teats reached grotesque extremes. Suspects were stripped and shaved while prickers, often self-proclaimed experts, stabbed their skin with silver needles. If a spot didn't bleed or elicit screams, it was proof of guilt, but the mark's locations fueled the hysteria's misogyny. Many were found on shameful body parts, breasts, genitals, armpits. A French trial transcript from 1606 describes a teenage girl's mark like a rose petal, high on her inner thigh, which the court declared the devil's kiss. The invasive searches weren't just about evidence, they were rituals of humiliation, reinforcing the idea that female bodies harbored corruption. Modern scholars suggest several explanations for these insensible spots. Some marks were likely ordinary scars or benign tumors. Others may have been calluses from manual labor, numb from years of work. The prickers themselves often used retractable needles or sleight of hand to fake their findings. Yet the mark's power lay in their ambiguity. Unlike confessions extracted under torture, these signs seemed objective, visible to anyone. A single mole could override a lifetime of piety, transforming a grandmother into a monster before her neighbor's eyes. The cruelest irony, as hunts intensified, the definition of witch marks expanded wildly. In Sweden, freckles became suspect. In Germany, extra nipples, a real but rare anatomical variation, were automatic death sentences. By the 17th century, even beauty marks weren't safe. The hunt for Satan's signatures had turned every human imperfection into potential condemnation, proving that when fear grips a society, the body itself becomes a battleground. The moment an accused witch entered the interrogation chamber, the rules of justice twisted into something unrecognizable. Medieval torturers had a grim arsenal designed not just to inflict pain, but to break minds and wills. Tools like the thumbscrew, a deceptively simple device that slowly crushed fingers to pulp. With each turn of the screw, bones splintered under iron plates, reducing hands to useless, mangled flesh. Victims didn't just confess to flying on broomsticks, they described riding dragons to the moon if it meant the agony would stop. Far more terrifying was the strappado, a brutal pulley system that dislocated shoulders with ruthless efficiency. The accused's hands were bound behind their back, then hoisted into the air by a rope, their entire body weight suddenly yanking against their joints. Some torturers added extra cruelty, dropping the victim mid-hang so their arms jerked backward with a sickening pop. German records from 1582 describe a baker's wife who endured this torture for hours before sobbing that she'd attended a Sabbat with 300 witches. Her confession included impossible details like feasting on roasted bats, clear signs of a mind shattered by pain. Then came the infamous dunking stool, not just a trial method but an interrogation tool. Unlike the public swimming tests, private dunkings were prolonged drownings in reverse. Victims were submerged until their lungs burned, then dragged gasping to the surface only to be plunged again. A priest's journal from Lorraine recounts how one woman confessed to poisoning 7 infants after 5 near drownings, despite witnesses confirming she'd been bedridden during the alleged crimes. The line between extracting truth and inventing nightmares vanished under the water's surface. Sleep deprivation, a torment that feels almost modern, was another favorite. In the witch prisons of Bamberg, guards kept suspects awake for days by forcing them to stand in iron-spiked shoes. After 72 hours without rest, hallucinations blended with reality. A 16-year-old girl named Margaretha, documented in trial transcripts, began seeing imps dancing in the candlelight and eventually admitted through slurred speech that she'd signed Satan's book with her own blood. Perhaps most psychologically cunning was the witch's chair. Studded with 500 spikes and heated from below, it forced victims into impossible choices: shift slightly, and the spikes pierced deeper; stay still, and their skin blistered. Surviving chairs in Austrian museums still show rust stains that might be blood. Confessions obtained this way often included elaborate demonic rituals, but historians note a chilling pattern. The more intricate the chair's spikes, the more theatrical the resulting confession. Pain didn't just extract admissions, it scripted them. Yet the darkest truth lies in the torturer's own records. Many manuals advised stopping just short of permanent injury so the accused could still stand trial and be burned alive properly. The cruelty wasn't incidental, it was bureaucratic. These techniques weren't the work of a few sadists but systematized violence, approved by judges and theologians alike. When every scream could be justified as saving the soul, there was no atrocity too great in the war against the invisible. While the fear of witchcraft spread like a shadow across medieval Europe, not every kingdom responded with equal fury. The intensity of witch hunts varied wildly depending on local laws, religious fervor, and even something as simple as geography. Take England, where trials were surprisingly rare compared to the continent. English courts demanded concrete evidence of harm: a cow dying after an argument, a farmer falling ill following a curse. Without it, even the most outlandish accusations often fizzled out. When executions did occur, they were usually by hanging rather than burning, a grim mercy by medieval standards. Cases like the Chelmsford trials in 1566 saw just 3 executions out of dozens accused, with some acquitted for lack of proof. The infamous witch-finder General Matthew Hopkins orchestrated England's deadliest spree in the 1640s, yet even his reign of terror claimed fewer than 300 lives, a fraction of what was to come elsewhere. Cross the Channel to France and a different pattern emerges. Here, regional courts operated with startling independence, leading to bizarre inconsistencies. In Normandy, accusations peaked during harvest failures, with over 600 executions recorded in the 16th century. Yet in nearby Brittany, pagan traditions lingered so strongly that witch trials were almost unheard of. Locals still left offerings for fairies well into the 1700s. The French parliaments often overturned lower court verdicts, sparing lives with appeals. But where panic took hold, as in the Basque Country in 1609, entire villages could be emptied. Germany became the epicenter of horror. Fractured into hundreds of small states, each with its own laws, the region became a patchwork of persecution. Ecclesiastical territories like Bamberg and Wurzburg, ruled by fanatical prince-bishops, saw some of the worst atrocities. In Bamberg alone, over 1,000 people burned between 1626 and 1631, including the city's own mayor. The hunts here weren't just about magic, they were power struggles, with accusations flying between Catholics and Protestants, nobles and commoners. Torture wasn't just permitted, it was systematized. The infamous Bamberg torture chamber, with its witch's chair studded with 500 spikes, became a factory for confessions. Spain and Italy defied expectations. Despite the Spanish Inquisition's fearsome reputation, its tribunals often dismissed witchcraft as peasant superstition. In 1610, inquisitors in Logroño investigated the massive Basque which panicked but commuted most death sentences. Italy's more urbanized society saw witchcraft treated as heresy rather than maleficium punishable, but rarely sparking mass hunts. Venetian records show cases where witches were simply exiled or given penance. Scandinavia's cold forests birthed unique fears. Swedish trials focused on Blackula, a mythical meadow where witches allegedly flew to meet Satan. Children's testimony was especially damning here. The Mora witch trials of 1668 saw 70 accused based on claims of youngsters who described being whisked away on goats. Meanwhile, Iceland's tiny population had barely 20 witch executions total, with men actually outnumbering women among the accused, a stark contrast to Europe's norm. These regional differences expose a chilling truth: witch hunts weren't inevitable outbreaks of hysteria but choices. Where courts demanded evidence, skepticism could temper fear. Where authority was fragmented, as in Germany, persecution spiraled unchecked. And where old beliefs mingled with new fears, as in Sweden's Blackula legends, the accusations took on lives of their own. The flames that consumed Europe's accused burned brightest not where magic was most feared, but where power was most unbalanced. The howl that echoed through the medieval forest wasn't always just a wolf, sometimes it was a neighbor transformed. Across Europe, fear of werewolves tangled with witchcraft hysteria, creating a terrifying hybrid of folklore and heresy. The case of Peter Stump, the so-called werewolf of Bedburg, reveals how these fears could erupt into full-blown nightmares. In 1589, German villagers claimed Stump had stalked the countryside on all fours, his paws stained with blood from slaughtered livestock and, worse, murdered children. Under torture, he confessed to wearing a wolfskin belt gifted by the devil, which supposedly granted him the power to shapeshift. His trial wasn't just about lycanthropy. Prosecutors accused him of attending witches' Sabbats, casting spells, and even committing incest with a daughter he'd allegedly fathered with a demon. When authorities executed him, they didn't just hang a murderer, they staged a grotesque spectacle, breaking his body on the wheel before beheading and burning him alongside his wolfskin as a warning against infernal pacts. What made werewolf accusations so potent was their visceral imagery. Unlike witches flying invisibly to Sabbats, werewolves left claw marks and half-eaten corpses in their wake. French records from the 1560s describe a tailor named Gilles Garnier who supposedly hunted children as a wolf near Dole, his teeth tearing flesh even after villagers shot him with silver bullets. These weren't just superstitions, they reflected genuine terror of wilderness and hunger. In famine-stricken regions, rumors spread of starving peasants turning to cannibalism, acts so unthinkable they were blamed on literal metamorphosis. A starving beggar gnawing on bones became, in the communal imagination, a wolf man cursed by dark forces. Theological debates fueled the frenzy. Some medieval scholars argued lycanthropy was purely demonic illusion, while others, like 16th-century physician Johann Weyer, suggested it was mental illness, a radical view that earned him accusations of heresy. The Church's stance hardened after the Council of Basel in 1437, which declared werewolves real servants of Satan akin to witches. This gave inquisitors license to treat shape-shifting claims as seriously as maleficium. In Livonia, modern-day Estonia, a man named Thies confessed in 1692 that he and other werewolves descended into hell 3 times a year to battle witches and rescue stolen crops. Instead of burning him, judges puzzled over whether he was a witch fighter or heretic, revealing the dizzying contradictions in these beliefs. The line between witch and werewolf often blurred in unexpected ways. French trial documents describe witches rubbing their bodies with enchanted salves not just to fly, but to sprout fur and fangs. Hungarian folklore spoke of Tolto's magicians who transformed into wolves to heal or curse. Even the Malleus Maleficarum noted cases where witches took wolf form to sneak into homes. These stories shared a common thread. The human body itself was unstable, permeable to supernatural forces. A witch's mark and a werewolf's fur were two sides of the same coin, proof that evil could reshape flesh. Yet the darkest aspect of these trials lies in their psychological torment. Unlike witches, who might be accused of abstract crimes like weather magic, werewolf suspects faced allegations of blood-soaked butchery. A shepherd in 16th century Austria, after days of torture, described feeling his bones crack and reform into a beast skeleton. His confession wasn't just about admitting guilt, it was about reliving the horror of his own supposed transformation. Modern scholars suggest some werewolves may have suffered from clinical lycanthropy, a rare delusion of becoming an animal, or ergot poisoning from moldy rye bread, which causes convulsions and vivid hallucinations. But in a world where the woods teemed with unseen dangers, the simpler explanation was often the most terrifying, that the monster wasn't out there but within. By the 17th century, werewolf trials faded as witch hunts grew more systematic, a shift that reveals an unsettling truth. As Europe urbanized, fears of wilderness predators gave way to anxieties about hidden enemies in human guise. The wolf lurking at the edge of the village became the witch next door. Yet the legacy of these hybrid panics endured, proving that when societies tremble on the brink of chaos, they'll always find new shapes for their oldest fears. In the dim glow of a medieval cottage, a woman grinds dried yarrow into powder, humming as she prepares a poultice for a child's fever. To her neighbors, she's a blessing until the fever breaks or doesn't. Then she becomes something far more dangerous. The line between healer and witch was perilously thin in the Middle Ages, where a deep understanding of herbs could mark a woman as either saint or sinner. Those who knew which plants eased labor pains or stopped bleeding walked a knife's edge, too skilled to ignore, too mysterious to trust. The very knowledge that made them indispensable also made them suspect. Records from 13th century England reveal how easily admiration could curdle into accusation. Marjorie Kemp, a midwife in Norfolk, was celebrated for her chamomile infusions that soothed colicky infants until a noblewoman's miscarriage was blamed on her overly potent brews. Without autopsy or evidence, Marjorie's expertise became proof of malice. Prosecutors argued only someone in league with dark forces could manipulate life so precisely. Her case wasn't unique. Across Europe, women who excelled in herbal medicine faced a cruel paradox: succeed too often, and you must be consorting with demons; fail once, and you've clearly invoked their wrath. The plants themselves fueled suspicion. Some, like belladonna or mandrake, had legitimate medicinal uses. Tiny doses could dull pain or slow bleeding. But their hallucinogenic properties and anthropomorphic roots made them lightning rods for fear. A German herbalist's garden containing henbane with its sticky black seeds might be reinterpreted overnight as a devil's pharmacy. Even benign herbs took on sinister tones when harvested under a full moon or whispered over practices often necessary for potency, but indistinguishable from magic to the untrained eye. Men practicing medicine faced far less scrutiny. Monastic infirmaries freely used the same plants women did, their work sanctified by the church's approval. A Benedictine monk might distill wormwood for digestion without raising eyebrows, while a village wise woman offering the same remedy risked accusations of poison. This double standard reveals the deeper anxiety. It wasn't the herbs that frightened authorities, but women operating outside male-controlled institutions. The darkest irony lay in childbirth, where midwives' knowledge saved lives yet sealed their fates. When a baby survived a difficult delivery thanks to ergot-derived contractions, the midwife was praised. But if the mother hemorrhaged or the child was stillborn, those same skills became evidence of witchcraft. French trial records describe birth witches, who supposedly choked newborns with invisible hands or stole them for Sabbats fantasies that arose from the very real, unexplained tragedies of medieval obstetrics. By the 15th century, even preventative medicine could be damning. A Scottish woman named Isabel Gowdy described using rowan berries to ward off illness, a folk practice centuries old. But when inquisitors reinterpreted her charms as invocations to Satan, her preventative care became proof of demonic pact. The herbs hadn't changed, only the lens through which they were viewed. This shifting perception of herbal knowledge reveals medieval medicine's central tension. In a world without germ theory or antibiotics, healing was mysterious, powerful, and therefore perilous. Women who mastered it didn't just challenge gender norms, they seemed to wield power over life and death itself, and in an age where unexplained cures were as terrifying as unexplained plagues, that made them targets. The same hands that pulled feverish children back from the brink could, with one unlucky turn, be bound for the pyre. By the 16th century, the certainty that had fueled witch hunts for generations began to crack under the weight of new ideas. The Renaissance, with its revival of classical learning and emphasis on human reason, slowly chipped away at the foundations of witchcraft hysteria. Scholars like Erasmus of Rotterdam mocked the notion of flying witches as peasant superstition, while physicians such as Johann Weyer argued that many accused witches were merely suffering from melancholy or delusion. Weyer's controversial book, De Prestigiis Daemonum, published in 1563, dared to suggest that Satan didn't need human allies to cause mischief. He could manipulate perception directly, making innocent people believe they'd committed impossible crimes. Though the Church condemned Weyer's work, his ideas spread quietly among intellectuals, planting seeds of doubt in the legal and theological certainty that had sent thousands to the stake. The printing press, which had once amplified fear by spreading texts like the Malleus Maleficarum, now became a tool for skepticism. Travelogues describing foreign cultures with different beliefs forced Europeans to question whether their own witch fears were universal truths or local prejudices. When Michel de Montaigne wrote in 1580 that it is putting a very high price on one's conjectures to have a man roasted alive because of them, his essay circulated among educated elites, challenging the very logic of witch trials. Even within the Church, cracks appeared. Spanish Inquisitor Alonso de Salazar Frias, investigating the Basque witch panic of 1610, demanded actual evidence instead of coerced confessions. His report, which exposed how torture manufactured witchcraft out of thin air, led to one of history's quietest revolutions, the Spanish Inquisition effectively ending large-scale witch prosecutions in its territories. Legal systems began shifting too. The Roman Carolina Code, which had once mandated death for witchcraft, was reinterpreted by 16th century judges who insisted on proof of tangible harm. In France, philosopher Jean Bodin's fiery defenses of witch hunting were countered by jurists like Francois Hotman, who argued that accusations often masked property disputes or personal vendettas. Courts in regions like the Netherlands and Scandinavia increasingly dismissed spectral evidence claims that demons or invisible witches had tormented victims as unreliable. The shift wasn't immediate or uniform, but the momentum was unmistakable. Where scripture and superstition had once ruled, reason and skepticism now pushed back. Yet the decline wasn't just intellectual, it was economic. As Europe's scientific revolution took hold, explanations once attributed to witchcraft found new answers in chemistry, astronomy, and medicine. Crop failures were linked to weather patterns, not cursed fields, illnesses traced to germs rather than hexes. The rise of insurance markets and banking systems offered alternatives to blaming misfortune on supernatural malice. Communities that had once burned a witch to end a drought now invested in irrigation. The world wasn't less perilous, but the unknown became something to study rather than to fear. Still, old beliefs died hard. In remote villages, witch trials persisted into the 18th century. and echoes of medieval hysteria flared during crises like the Salem Panic of 1692. But the tide had turned. The same Renaissance curiosity that painted anatomically correct cadavers and mapped the stars also made it harder to believe in Sabbats and sinister pacts. What faded wasn't fear itself, but the certainty that burning the right person could ever dispel it. The witch's pyre, once a beacon of order in a chaotic world, guttered out not with a bang but with the slow, stubborn light of doubt. Walking through a modern Wiccan shop today, with its polished crystals, lavender-scented candles, and shelves of ethically sourced herbs, you'd be forgiven for thinking witchcraft had always been this benign. But the truth is, the gentle earth-centered spirituality practiced by contemporary pagans shares almost nothing with the dark arts feared in the Middle Ages. Modern Wicca, formalized in the 1950s by Gerald Gardner, draws inspiration from pre-Christian nature worship, revering the sacred feminine and marking seasonal cycles like solstices and harvests. It's a far cry from the medieval witch who was imagined as a servant of Satan lurking in shadows, blighting crops with curses and feasting on stolen children. The most glaring difference lies in their core beliefs about power. Today's Wiccans follow the rule of three, the idea that energy sent out, positive or negative, returns threefold, a philosophy that discourages harmful magic. Medieval witchcraft, as defined by its persecutors, was inherently destructive. Church records describe witches as soldiers in Satan's war against humanity, their magic fueled by malice and demonic bargains. A 16th-century woodcut depicts witches conjuring hailstorms to ruin harvests, while a current Wiccan might perform a rain dance to bless the land. One was framed as an assault on divine order, the other seeks harmony with it. Even their rituals diverge radically. Modern pagans often cast circles under full moons, calling upon elemental forces with carefully worded invocations. Compare that to the Sabbats described in medieval trial confessions, grotesque parodies of Christian rites where witches supposedly desecrated communion wafers and kissed the devil's backside. These accounts, extracted under torture, say more about the fears of inquisitors than any real practices. Contemporary covens emphasize consent and personal growth, whereas historical witches, if they existed as accused, were framed as coerced into pacts through terror or temptation. The role of women in both traditions highlights another stark contrast. Wicca celebrates female divinity through goddess worship, offering spiritual authority to priestesses. Medieval witchcraft accusations, on the other hand, weaponized femininity, portraying women as morally weak and sexually voracious vessels for demonic influence. A Wiccan today might invoke Hecate for wisdom. A medieval midwife risked being branded a witch for easing childbirth pains with the same herbs ancient priestesses once blessed. Perhaps the most poignant distinction is their relationship with the natural world. Neo-pagans see nature as sacred, often championing environmental causes. Medieval witches were accused of corrupting nature, poisoning wells, souring milk, and summoning storms. The very things modern Wiccans cherish, knowledge of plants, lunar cycles, and weather patterns, were once twisted into evidence of heresy. This isn't to say modern paganism exists in complete isolation from history. Some practices, like using mandrake root or hanging protective charms, echo folk traditions persecuted in the past. But to conflate the two is to mistake a peaceful revival for the nightmares that fueled the fires of the witch hunts. The real magic of contemporary witchcraft lies not in fear, but in reclaiming what was once lost, transforming old shadows into new light. Beneath the soil of medieval villages and hidden within the walls of centuries-old cottages, archaeologists have uncovered silent witnesses to Europe's witchcraft panic, objects that whisper of both genuine folk magic and the terror that twisted it into heresy. Take the witch bottles dredged from English riverbeds and excavated beneath hearthstones. These small, salt-glazed vessels, dating to the 16th and 17th centuries, held jagged nails, rusted pins, and curled human hair soaked in urine, ingredients meant to repel curses or trap malicious spirits. One found in Greenwich still bore finger marks in the clay, pressed by someone desperate enough to believe their own bodily fluids could armor them against the unseen. Modern analysis reveals these bottles weren't superstition alone. Some contained traces of medicinal herbs like vervain, suggesting they straddled the line between folk remedy and ritual. Far older but equally haunting are the lead curse tablets discovered in Roman baths and medieval wells across Europe. These thin sheets, scratched with backward Latin invocations and stabbed through with nails, show how pagan traditions endured even as Christianity condemned them. A tablet from Bath, England, implores the goddess Sulis to destroy the thief who stole my cloak, a plea that 5 centuries later might have been recast as evidence of maleficium. The continuity is chilling. The same wells where priests baptized infants also held whispered spells, proving how deeply magic intertwined with daily life before the church redrew the lines between piety and heresy. Then there are the protective marks etched into the very bones of medieval homes. Using advanced imaging, archaeologists have uncovered hundreds of hexafoils and interlocking circles carved into door frames and bedposts from Scotland to Hungary. At Knowle House in Kent, restorers found these witch marks concealed under layers of paint, clustered where evil might seep in. Window latches, hearths, even the joints of baby cradles. Some designs mirrored apotropaic symbols from pre-Christian times, suggesting folk traditions quietly survived beneath a veneer of Christian conformity. A shepherd's cottage in the Swiss Alps revealed a threshold gouged with overlapping vs. a motif known locally as witch crosses, though its true meaning faded with the people who carved them. Perhaps the most poignant finds are the small, personal items that escaped the notice of witch hunters. In a latrine in Riga, excavators uncovered a bundle of yarrow and St. John's wort bound with red thread herbs long associated with protection, carefully hidden rather than burned. A Danish midden yielded a child's leather shoe stuffed with rowan berries, likely placed there by a mother hoping to ward off infant-stealing hags. These weren't the tools of devil worshippers, but the quiet resistance of ordinary people navigating a world where misfortune could be blamed on a neighbor's envy. Yet the artifacts also exposed the hysteria's manufactured nature. In the cellar of a Bamberg torture chamber, archaeologists found a witch's bridle, a spiked iron gag used to silence screaming victims. Nearby lay counterfeit devil's marks, crude stamps that inquisitors may have used to brand suspects during sham examinations. Most damning are the trial records themselves, preserved in municipal archives. Marginal notes reveal how interrogators fed accused witches specific details, descriptions of Sabbats, familiar spirits, that later appeared word for word in confessions. The physical evidence aligns with a grim truth. Many witchcraft practices were invented not by the accused but by their torturers. One discovery in particular blurs the line between myth and reality. A cottage in Germany's Black Forest yielded a clay jar containing a handwritten charm invoking the secret names of the angel Raziel to cure fever. Dated to 1492, the height of which panics, it proves some did practice ritual magic, though not the satanic kind the church feared. The charm's Hebrew phrases, likely copied from a stolen Kabbalistic text, reveal a world where folk healers borrowed from forbidden sources, desperate for any power to stave off suffering. These artifacts don't just tell us about witchcraft, they reveal the anxieties of an age where the supernatural felt as real as the plague. A nail-studded bottle wasn't just a charm, it was a plea for control in a world where a hailstorm could mean starvation and a neighbor's grudge could become a death sentence. The marks on a doorframe weren't idle scratches, but a family's attempt to guard against forces they couldn't name. Archaeology strips away the layers of myth, showing us not the witches of inquisitors' nightmares, but the fragile humanity of those who lived and died in their shadow. The crooked figure hunched over a cauldron, her bony fingers clutching a wand as demons swirl around her. This wasn't just medieval propaganda, but a carefully crafted nightmare immortalized in ink and paint. Artists of the Middle Ages didn't merely depict witches, they weaponized imagery to shape public terror. Take Hans Baldung Green's infamous woodcut from 1510, Witches' Sabbath, where naked women ride goats backward under a stormy sky, their bodies twisted in ecstasy and dread. Every detail, the broken crucifix, the skeletal infant held aloft, served a purpose: to turn abstract fears into visceral, unforgettable scenes. These weren't neutral portraits but visual sermons, screaming from church walls and pamphlet pages that witchcraft was real, rampant, and lurking behind every neighbor's smile. Church carvings took the horror deeper, literally embedding it in sacred spaces. On the doors of Notre Dame de Paris, a 12th century capital, shows a witch being carried off by demons, her distended belly symbolizing gluttony and lust. The message was unavoidable: stray from God's path, and this awaits. In Italy's Orvieto Cathedral, frescoes juxtapose the martyrdoms of saints with witches boiling potions, equating heresy with treason against heaven itself. The artistry was exquisite, the terror deliberate. By placing witches alongside biblical villains like Judas or Herod, the Church framed them as existential threats to the soul. Yet the most chilling depictions weren't grand masterpieces but crude pamphlets cranked out by the thousands. Cheap woodcuts accompanying witch trial broadsheets reduced complex accusations to simple, shareable horrors. A 1626 German print shows a witch milking an axe handle to steal a neighbor's cow's milk. An absurd image, but one that validated rural anxieties about unexplained shortages. These weren't art for art's sake, they were psychological warfare, turning superstition into evidence anyone could recognize. If a village debated whether old Agnes was a witch, a printed image of her doppelganger stirring a storm in a cauldron tilted the scales toward flame. The irony: many artistic tropes borrowed from older, benign traditions. Witches' cauldrons echoed Celtic myths of regenerative pots, while their flying ointments mimicked shamanic journeying. Even the iconic pointed hat, now a Halloween staple, originated from medieval Jewish dress, a detail anti-Semitic artists co-opted to link witches to other persecuted groups. The art didn't create the witch panic, but it crystallized it, giving fear a face, a form, and ultimately, a fuel that burned hotter than any pyre. The echoes of medieval witchcraft hysteria linger long after the last pyres cooled. For centuries, societies convinced themselves that burning the right person could restore order, whether that meant purging heresy, silencing independent women, or blaming human suffering on imagined villains. The terror wasn't just about magic, it was about control. When crops failed, when children died, when the world felt like it was unraveling, the witch became a focal point for collective fear. She wasn't a person anymore, she was a symbol, a canvas onto which societies projected their deepest anxieties. What made these fears so potent was their flexibility. Witchcraft accusations could target anyone: the healer who knew too much, the widow who owned land, the outsider who spoke a different language. The same logic that condemned a German midwife in 1586 for stealing milk through curses could be repurposed centuries later to vilify immigrants, political dissidents, or marginalized groups. The mechanics of scapegoating haven't changed, only the labels have. Modern moral panics still follow the same playbook: identify an enemy, amplify their supposed threat, and justify extreme measures in the name of safety. The medieval witch hunt's darkest legacy isn't just its body count, it's the blueprint it left for how easily fear can erode justice. When societies feel threatened, the first casualty is often nuanced. Yet there's a glimmer of hard-won wisdom in this history. The witch trials didn't end because humanity became universally enlightened. They faded because enough people, judges, scholars, even some clergy, began demanding evidence over hearsay. That shift, however slow and uneven, offers a lesson. Fear thrives in silence, but skepticism can be contagious. So the next time you hear whispers of a new witch hunt, pause. Ask who benefits from the panic. Question whose stories are being silenced. The stakes may not be fire and rope anymore, but the human cost of unchecked hysteria remains. The past doesn't merely haunt us, it holds up a mirror, asking if we've truly learned to recognize the real monsters.